October 24th, 1917, Caporetto, Italy. Lieutenant Carlo Moretti had eaten nothing but a piece of mouldy bread in 4 days. The Italian Second Army was collapsing under Austro-German assault, supply lines severed, ration dumps overrun or abandoned. Around him, soldiers threw away rifles to carry loaves of bread scavenged from destroyed bakeries, valued food over ammunition because hunger killed as surely as bullets. Moretti watched men fight over a dead mule, cutting meat from the carcass with bayonets, eating it raw because no one had time or fuel for cooking. His own stomach had stopped cramping 2 days earlier, the sharp pains of hunger replaced by dull weakness that made every movement require conscious effort. This was starvation in modern warfare. Industrial armies outrunning their supply chains, soldiers reduced to scavenging and theft, military effectiveness collapsing as calories became more precious than courage. In 27 years, another generation would fight across this same Italian landscape, but American soldiers would carry 3 days of emergency rations, enjoy hot meals prepared in mobile kitchens, and receive airdrop supplies when ground transport failed. The transformation from starvation to abundance would measure not just improved logistics, but evolved understanding that hungry soldiers couldn't fight effectively, that feeding armies was as important as arming them, that victory required full stomachs as much as brave hearts. The Great War began with 19th century logistics attempting to feed 20th century armies. The scale of mobilization exceeded all planning. France mobilized 8.4 million men, Germany mobilized 11 million, Britain eventually mobilized 5 million, Russia mobilized 12 million. These vast armies required feeding with systems designed for forces 1/10 their size. The inevitable result was hunger, sometimes acute starvation, always uncertainty about when the next meal would arrive. The supply chain failures began immediately. Railroads, the primary method of moving supplies, couldn't handle the volume. Bottlenecks developed at every transfer point. Food spoiled waiting for transport. Units advanced beyond their supply lines, then faced hunger when rations failed to catch up. The chaos of mobile warfare in 1914 created situations where entire divisions went days without proper rations, living on whatever they could requisition, steal, or scavenge from the countryside. When the war settled into trench stalemate by early 1915, supply lines stabilized somewhat, but hunger remained a constant threat. The trenches were supplied through a chain that stretched from ports through rail depots to forward dumps, then by wagon and finally by carrying parties moving through communication trenches. Each link in this chain could fail. Ships were sunk by submarines, rail lines were bombed, roads became impassable in rain, wagons broke down, carrying parties were caught by artillery. When any link failed, soldiers went hungry. The official rations, when they arrived intact, provided subsistence but not satisfaction. British soldiers received approximately 4,000 calories daily in theory, but actual consumption was often half that amount. The rations consisted of preserved foods designed for storage rather than nutrition. Hardtack biscuits, canned corned beef, tea, sugar, and jam. Fresh food was rare luxury. Vegetables appeared as dried sheets that reconstituted poorly. Meat came in tins, grey and fatty. The monotony was as difficult as the shortage, same foods day after day until soldiers could barely force them down. French soldiers fared somewhat better due to fighting in their own country. Access to local food sources supplemented military rations. French soldiers received wine daily, bread more often than hardtack, and occasionally fresh meat. However, French supply difficulties were severe in forward areas. During major battles like Verdun, supply chains collapsed under demand. French soldiers at Verdun sometimes went 3 days without hot food, surviving on emergency rations designed for single-day use. German soldiers experienced progressive starvation as the British naval blockade tightened. In 1914, German rations were adequate, sometimes generous. By 1916, shortages appeared. By 1917, rations had declined to barely sufficient levels. By 1918, German soldiers were systematically underfed, receiving 1,500 to 2,000 calories daily when heavy labour required 4,000. The blockade strangled German food supplies, affecting military and civilian populations simultaneously. German soldiers wrote letters describing constant hunger, trading valuables for food, stealing from each other and from occupied territories. The hunger affected combat effectiveness measurably. Undernourished soldiers tired quickly, couldn't think clearly, became susceptible to disease. Units short of rations showed declining combat performance before actual starvation set in. Commanders learned that hungry soldiers couldn't fight effectively, no matter how well trained or courageously led. The British Army implemented minimum calorie requirements after studies showed direct correlation between ration adequacy and combat performance. The extreme cases involved actual starvation during sieges and retreats. The siege of Kut in Mesopotamia saw British and Indian forces reduced to 1,000 calories daily, then 500, finally eating horses, mules and rats before surrendering in April 1916. Survivors described hallucinations, inability to stand, complete psychological breakdown from sustained starvation. The Russian retreat of 1915 saw entire armies outrun their supplies, soldiers dying from hunger while trying to escape German advances. The Italian retreat from Caporetto left tens of thousands without rations for days, men abandoning positions to search for food. The winter of 1916 to 1917, the turnip winter in Germany, showed what sustained food shortage did to populations. German civilians survived on turnips and bread adulterated with sawdust and other fillers. German soldiers, supposedly prioritized for rations, still went hungry. The social contract between government and people fractured over hunger. Strikes and unrest increased. Military effectiveness declined as underfed soldiers couldn't sustain effort required for offensive operations. The psychological impact of constant hunger was profound and lasting. Soldiers developed obsessions with food, talking endlessly about meals they would eat after the war, planning elaborate menus, describing dishes with precision that approached madness. Letters home focused on food requests. Specific items soldiers craved desperately. Dreams featured banquets and feasts. Waking life focused on stomach pain and weakness. The psychological trauma of sustained hunger affected veterans for decades, many developing hoarding behaviors or disordered eating patterns that persisted long after food became available. The survival strategies soldiers developed ranged from ingenious to desperate. Soldiers stole from supply dumps, risking severe punishment for extra rations. They trapped rats in trenches, roasting the meat over improvised fires. They scavenged in no man's land at night, searching dead bodies and abandoned positions for rations. They traded with enemy soldiers during informal truces, exchanging tobacco for food. They requisitioned aggressively from civilian populations, sometimes crossing the line into theft or extortion. The class disparities in food access created resentment that undermined morale. Officers ate better than enlisted men, with access to private supplies and better field messes. Rear echelon troops ate regularly, while frontline soldiers went hungry. Staff officers in comfortable billets consumed multiple courses, while men in trenches survived on hardtack and bully beef. These visible inequalities, justified by rank and position, nevertheless created anger that sometimes exceeded that directed at the enemy. The role of packages from home became crucial for survival. British soldiers received parcels from families containing foods unavailable through military supply. Biscuits, chocolate, tinned meats, preserved fruits. These packages supplemented inadequate rations, sometimes making the difference between hunger and sufficiency. However, not all soldiers had families who could afford to send packages, creating another inequality that divided units along socio-economic lines. The medical consequences of sustained undernourishment accumulated steadily. Soldiers developed scurvy from vitamin C deficiency despite the 20th century. Night blindness appeared from vitamin A shortage. Wounds healed slowly or not at all due to protein deficiency. Immune systems weakened, making soldiers vulnerable to infections that well-nourished men would resist. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed soldiers more readily because years of inadequate nutrition had weakened their systems. Starvation didn't have to be absolute to kill. Chronic undernourishment made men vulnerable to diseases that normally weren't fatal. The agricultural mobilization on the home front couldn't keep pace with military demand. Farmers were conscripted, leaving fewer workers to produce food. Horses were requisitioned for military use, reducing agricultural productivity. Fertilizer production was diverted to explosives manufacturing. The result was declining food production even as demand increased. Nations that had been food exporters before 1914 struggled to feed their own populations by 1917. The blockade strategy targeted enemy food supplies deliberately. The British naval blockade of Germany aimed to starve the Central Powers into submission. It succeeded, but at cost of hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths and immense suffering among soldiers and civilians alike. The tactic worked, but the moral implications troubled many. Starvation as weapon of war was effective but brutal, killing indiscriminately and causing suffering that persisted long after the war ended. American entry into the war in 1917 shifted the food equation dramatically. American agricultural production, which had continued expanding during the war, could now be directed to Allied forces. American wheat, meat, and other foodstuffs flowed across the Atlantic in increasing quantities. American soldiers brought their own rations, well supplied, and more varied than Allied equivalents. The American Expeditionary Force consumed more food per soldier than any other army, maintaining standards that seemed luxurious to Allied troops who had been hungry for years. The end of the war in November 1918 didn't end hunger immediately. Demobilization of soldiers and restoration of supply chains took months. Many veterans returned home to nations where food remained scarce. German and Austrian civilians faced continued starvation through 1919 as the blockade remained partially in effect. Russian soldiers returning home found famine conditions that would worsen into the catastrophic hunger of 1921 to 1922. The hunger of war extended into peace for millions. The interwar years saw military theorists studying logistics, including food supply. The lessons were clear. Armies that ate well fought better. Supply lines required protection and redundancy. Hunger undermined effectiveness regardless of tactical skill. By 1939, when war returned to Europe, these lessons had been absorbed by some militaries, but not all. The difference in how armies fed their soldiers would become another factor determining victory and defeat. September 1st, 1939, Poland. The Wehrmacht advanced with supply trains that included field kitchens, mobile bakeries, and refrigerated trucks. German soldiers in the Polish campaign ate hot meals regularly, received fresh bread daily, and were supplied adequately despite rapid advance. This was blitzkrieg supported by logistics that could keep pace with mechanized warfare. The Polish forces, fighting desperately against overwhelming force, nevertheless maintained supply lines that fed their soldiers when possible. Both sides understood that hungry armies couldn't fight effectively. The catastrophic hunger of the Great War would not be repeated in this new conflict, at least not in its opening phases, at least not for the mechanized armies that fought with 20th century efficiency rather than 19th century improvisation. World War II began with better logistics than its predecessor, but hunger still appeared wherever supply lines broke down or were deliberately destroyed. The difference was that major combatants, particularly the United States, had developed systems that could maintain food supply even under difficult conditions. The American military entered the war determined that its soldiers would never experience the hunger that had plagued earlier conflicts. The American approach to feeding soldiers was comprehensive and systematic. Multiple layers of rations ensured food availability regardless of tactical situation. The A ration was normal garrison food, fresh or refrigerated items prepared in kitchens. The B ration was field rations requiring cooking but not refrigeration. The C ration was individual canned rations requiring no preparation. The K ration was lightweight individual rations for mobile troops. The D ration was emergency chocolate bars for survival situations. This layered system meant soldiers always had food, even when supply chains were disrupted. The quantities were staggering. The US military purchased or produced enough food to provide every soldier, with 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily. This exceeded requirements for most soldiers, but ensured no one went hungry. The surplus was distributed as extra rations or waste, but hunger was eliminated as a factor affecting American combat effectiveness. Soldiers complained about the monotony of C rations or the taste of K rations, but they never experienced actual hunger. The logistics that delivered this food represented triumph of industrial organization. Refrigerated ships carried fresh meat across oceans. Mobile bakeries produced bread near front lines. Field kitchens prepared hot meals within miles of combat. Airdrops delivered supplies when ground transport was impossible. The system had redundancy at every level, ensuring that when one method failed, others maintained supply flow. The contrast with Axis forces became increasingly stark as the war progressed. German soldiers, well fed early in the war, experienced declining rations as the conflict turned against them. By 1944, German rations had fallen to levels barely sufficient for survival. By 1945, German soldiers were systematically hungry, receiving 2,000 calories daily or less, often going days without hot meals. The Eastern Front was particularly brutal, where extreme cold increased caloric requirements while supply difficulties reduced actual food availability. Japanese soldiers experienced the war's worst hunger. Japanese military culture emphasized endurance and self-sacrifice, treating hunger as test of spirit rather than logistics failure. Japanese soldiers frequently operated on 1,500 calories daily, sometimes much less. On Pacific islands cut off from resupply, Japanese troops starved systematically. Guadalcanal, New Guinea and Philippines campaigns saw Japanese soldiers dying from hunger as much as combat. The Japanese military's failure to prioritize food supply was a strategic blunder that cost tens of thousands of lives. The island campaigns in the Pacific demonstrated both American abundance and Japanese deprivation. American forces on Pacific islands ate hot meals, received regular resupply, and had access to luxuries like ice cream. Japanese forces on the same island starved, reduced to eating roots, grass, and bark. When American forces overran Japanese positions, they found enemy soldiers so weakened by hunger they couldn't fight effectively. Medical examinations of Japanese prisoners showed severe malnutrition, some weighing less than 90 pounds, bodies consuming their own tissue for survival. The siege of Leningrad showed hunger's role in modern warfare at its most extreme. The German siege lasted 872 days, during which time over 1 million Soviet civilians and soldiers died, many from starvation. Rations fell to 125 grams of bread daily, supplemented by whatever could be found or improvised. People ate wallpaper paste, leather, sawdust mixed with flour. Hunger became a weapon as effective as bombs, though far more cruel. The survivors emerged so traumatized by starvation that psychological scars persisted for life. The German siege strategy deliberately targeted food supplies, surround cities, cut supply lines, and wait for hunger to force surrender. This strategy worked in some cases, though at terrible human cost. The moral implications were clear. Starvation was being used systematically as military tactic. The Geneva Conventions addressed treatment of prisoners, but said little about deliberate starvation of civilian populations. The legal and ethical frameworks were inadequate for addressing hunger as weapon. Soviet soldiers often operated under food scarcity that would have seemed intolerable to American forces. Soviet logistics prioritized ammunition over food, accepting that soldiers would be hungry if that ensured they had bullets. Soviet rations were frequently inadequate, supplemented by requisitioning from civilian populations or captured German supplies. The Soviet military accepted casualties from hunger and exposure that other armies would have considered unacceptable. The liberation of concentration camps revealed hunger used as extermination tool. Camp inmates were deliberately starved, given rations calculated to produce death within months. The images of skeletal survivors shocked the world, showing what sustained starvation did to human bodies and spirits. Allied soldiers who liberated camps were traumatized by what they saw, the evidence of systematic starvation as policy rather than accidental deprivation. The comparison between American abundance and Axis deprivation became propaganda tool. American soldiers were photographed eating hot meals, holding ice cream, drinking Coca-Cola. These images were distributed to show American material superiority. Axis soldiers saw these images and understood they fought enemies who could waste more food than they received. The psychological impact supplemented the physical advantages of proper nutrition. The German prisoners of war who entered American custody experienced hunger's end abruptly. Men who had been systematically underfed for months suddenly received 3,500 calories daily. Many gained weight rapidly, some becoming healthier as prisoners than they had been as soldiers. This reversal undermined Nazi ideology more effectively than propaganda could. If prisoners ate better than soldiers, what did that say about German strength versus American abundance? Japanese prisoners experienced similar transformation. Soldiers who had been starving on Pacific islands received American rations and gained dramatic amounts of weight. Medical examinations showed Japanese prisoners recovering from severe malnutrition within weeks of adequate feeding. The speed of recovery demonstrated that hunger, not some inherent physical weakness, had been the problem. The strategic bombing campaigns targeted food production and distribution deliberately. Allied bombers struck German and Japanese agricultural areas, rail lines, and food storage facilities. The goal was to degrade enemy ability to feed their populations and militaries. The tactic was effective but controversial, as it caused civilian suffering alongside military impact. The moral distinction between starving soldiers and starving civilians was debatable at best. Doctors recognized the stages of caloric deprivation, understood vitamin deficiencies, and knew how to treat starvation when resources permitted. This knowledge didn't prevent hunger, but allowed better management of its consequences. Soldiers with access to medical care could be treated for malnutrition-related diseases that would have been fatal in the Great War. The refeeding of starved populations required careful management. Concentration camp survivors couldn't be given normal rations immediately. Their bodies had adapted to starvation and couldn't process regular food. Medical personnel had to implement gradual refeeding protocols, starting with liquid nutrition and slowly increasing calories. Some survivors died from refeeding syndrome when given too much food too quickly, their hearts failing under the metabolic demands of digestion. The long-term health consequences of wartime hunger affected millions. Children who experienced malnutrition during the war showed developmental delays and health problems decades later. Dutch hunger winter survivors, starved during 1944 to 1945, showed increased rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other conditions in later life. The hunger of childhood and adolescence had permanent effects that appeared in middle age and old age. Psychological trauma of hunger persisted similarly. People who experienced severe food deprivation during the war developed anxiety around food that lasted for life. Hoarding behaviors appeared, compulsive eating when food was available, inability to waste food regardless of quality or need. These behaviors, adaptive during starvation, became maladaptive in peacetime abundance. The psychological scars of hunger proved as lasting as physical ones. The contrast between soldiers who experienced hunger and those who didn't created different veteran experiences. American veterans returned, remembering good food, sometimes boredom with rations but rarely actual hunger. German, Japanese, and Soviet veterans returned with memories of constant hunger, of weakness from inadequate food, of watching comrades die from starvation. These different experiences shaped how veterans remembered and discussed the war. American soldiers celebrated with special meals, steak dinners, and ice cream. German civilians, including former soldiers, faced continued food shortages that would persist for years. The contrast was stark and deliberate. The victors ate well while the defeated went hungry. This wasn't cruelty but consequence of destroyed infrastructure and depleted resources. Germany couldn't feed its population until agricultural production and distribution systems were rebuilt. August 15th, 1945. Victory over Japan. American forces in the Pacific consumed celebration meals while Japanese civilians faced starvation. The Japanese food distribution system had collapsed. Cities were destroyed, farms were damaged, and transportation networks were ruined. American occupation forces eventually provided food assistance, preventing mass starvation, but not eliminating hunger. The transition from war to peace didn't immediately restore food security. The post-war accounting of hunger casualties was difficult but necessary. Estimates suggest that starvation and malnutrition killed millions during World War II, in addition to combat deaths. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed perhaps 3 million. The Dutch hunger winter killed 20,000. The siege of Leningrad killed over 1 million. Concentration camps killed millions partly through deliberate starvation. Japanese soldiers died by tens of thousands from hunger on isolated Pacific islands. The total was staggering and shameful. The lessons learned influenced post-war military doctrine. Modern armies prioritized logistics, understanding that feeding troops was prerequisite for effectiveness. The US. Military maintained emphasis on soldier nutrition, developing improved rations and supply systems. The meal ready to eat, introduced in the 1980 seconds, descended directly from World War II ration research. Modern soldiers rarely experience hunger, at least not in American and NATO forces. The comparison between wars revealed evolution in military capability and priorities. The Great War had featured widespread hunger as normal experience, accepted as unavoidable consequence of industrial warfare. World War II showed that hunger could be eliminated through proper logistics and prioritization, at least for well-supplied forces. The difference measured industrial capacity, organizational sophistication, and commitment to soldier welfare. The story told in Hunger and Survival, from Great War starvation to World War II's divergent experiences, captured the transformation in how modern militaries functioned. The Great War soldier who went days without adequate food, who fought while weakened by hunger, who sometimes died from starvation rather than combat, represented warfare where logistics lagged behind weapons technology. The World War II American soldier who ate hot meals regularly, who had multiple ration types ensuring food availability, who never experienced actual hunger, represented warfare where logistics matched tactical capabilities. But the story also captured inequality and cruelty. The American soldier who ate ice cream in 1944 fought against Japanese soldiers who were starving. The German prisoner who gained weight in American captivity had been systematically underfed by his own military. The concentration camp survivor who weighed 70 pounds at liberation had been deliberately starved by captors who had adequate food for themselves. Hunger was used as weapon, deliberately inflicted, systematically applied, causing suffering that exceeded combat wounds. The final lesson was that hunger remained vulnerability even in modern warfare. Supply lines could be cut, logistics could fail, and soldiers could starve regardless of technological sophistication. The difference was that some militaries had developed redundancy and capacity to prevent starvation even when primary supply chains failed, while others hadn't. The American military's multiple ration types, airdrop capabilities, and logistical flexibility eliminated hunger as factor affecting combat effectiveness. Other militaries, lacking these capabilities, saw their soldiers weakened or killed by inadequate nutrition. In the end, The soldiers who survived both wars through hunger and starvation carried memories that shaped the rest of their lives. Those who had been hungry never forgot what starvation felt like, the weakness, the obsession with food, the fear that hunger would return. Those who had been well-fed sometimes felt guilty about their abundance while others starved. The hunger that soldiers experienced or avoided became part of their war stories, shaping how they remembered and how they lived afterward. The transformation from Great War starvation to World War II, abundance, at least for some forces, measured progress in military logistics and industrial capacity. But it also measured inequality, showing that some soldiers ate well because their nations could produce and deliver food in unprecedented quantities, while others starved because their nations couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate supply. Hunger in warfare revealed not just logistics but values, showing which militaries prioritized soldier welfare and which accepted starvation as acceptable cost of operations. The soldiers who survived did so partly through personal resilience, partly through luck, and partly through whether their military establishment considered feeding them important enough to invest resources in preventing hunger. That difference, between armies that prevented starvation and those that accepted it, helped determine who won and who lost, who survived and who died, not from enemy bullets but from lack of food that should have been fundamental right of any soldier asked to fight.